Hello, thank you very much for watching this introduction to restorative justice. My name is Lindsey Pointer. Let's go ahead and get started. So like I said, this presentation will be an introduction to the philosophy and practice of restorative justice. Before we get into that, I'd love to give a little bit of history about myself. So I actually first started working as a restorative justice practitioner, volunteering with a local program while I was still doing my undergraduate studies. I learned about restorative justice in a nonviolence course and was immediately hooked on the philosophy. It seemed like such a promising alternative to the mainstream approach to justice issues. But after graduating, I went on to work with a program called Longmont Community Justice Partnership in Longmont, Colorado. They do restorative justice processes as a diversion for both youth and adults and misdemeanor through felony level crimes. I was the program manager for their community restorative justice program there. I left Longmont when I received a Fulbright scholarship to go to New Zealand to study restorative justice. New Zealand is widely considered the leader in this field. They've managed to integrate restorative justice more fully into both the juvenile and adult justice systems than pretty much any other country in the world. So it was a real privilege and a gift to get to study this work in New Zealand. I ended up staying past the culmination of my Fulbright to pursue a PhD in restorative justice, looking at the process in the criminal justice system and understanding how it works to provide a transformative experience for individuals and also to uphold community norms and give kind of a full experience of justice to participants. Now I'm doing a wide range of facilitation and community education work, providing training, teaching at a couple universities, and then also facilitating cases in the community. So that gives a little bit of information about me. Restorative justice is definitely my passion and my life's work, and so I'm very honored and excited to have the chance to share it with you today. So I'd love to start with a story that I think helps to give an illustration of how restorative justice differs from our more mainstream approaches to justice in the criminal justice system and also in schools, universities, and community issues, though this case comes from the criminal justice space. So I'm going to introduce this story first and talk about kind of what could have happened and what did happen in the restorative justice process. So Sally, age 25, was spending the afternoon with her grandmother, Violet, who's 73. The phone rang and Violet answered. She heard a man screaming on the other end saying, "You cut me off. I know where you live and I'm going to come get you." Violet tried to explain that he must have the wrong number, but the man continued screaming profanities and threats and eventually she hung up. When the man called back a second time, Sally took the phone. She tried again to say it was the wrong number and told him to stop calling or she would call the police. But the yelling and threats only escalated. The man on the phone told Sally that he would find her and threaten sexual violence. Sally hung up and called the police. When the police arrived, the man had called again, and when the woman didn't answer, he left a message on the machine with the same threats and profanities. The following months, while the police department attempted to track down the caller, were extremely difficult for Sally and Violet and for their family. Violet felt nervous every time she went outside the house, worried that the man on the phone really would find her and do the awful things he had threatened. For months, the fear of this encounter loomed over her. For Sally, it was even worse. As a child, Sally had been the victim of sexual and physical assault. In the months following the phone calls, Sally grappled with the resurfacing of painful memories and experienced horrible nightmares. When I spoke with Sally during our intake phone call, she said the man on the phone sounded just angry and crazy enough to actually do the things he had threatened. The fear was real and constant. So you can see this case, we have a case of harassment over the phone. These two women now living with extreme fear from what had happened. So if you think about this going through the standard court system, when they eventually found the man who did it, his name was Joel, eventually he would receive charges for the harassment and some sort of punitive sanction, some sort of punishment. In this case, it would likely be fines, maybe probation, potentially jail time for this case. oftentimes what we see with those punitive sanctions or with punishment is that they end up increasing harm to the offender, or what I'll call the responsible party, because that offender-victim language tends to carry quite a bit of stigmatizing impact for individuals. So I like to instead use the terms of responsible party, which refers more to the specific incident rather than who the person is as a whole. So oftentimes with a punishment, we're seeing increased harm to that responsible party and also to their community. So maybe there are family members who are then without this person who is providing for them when they're behind bars, or this fine creates additional strain in their family and community. There's also just the stigmatizing impact of being labeled through the criminal justice system. And what we see is that when individuals experience that stigmatizing shame, oftentimes they go on to repeat the behavior because they begin to identify with this identity as an offender. So oftentimes you're seeing an increase in harm to the offender, to the wider community. So we're responding to the harm that's been caused by causing additional harm. Additionally, the harmed parties, or the victims, would continue to feel that fear that they were talking about. There'd be a lack of resolution because there's still many unanswered questions. I remember just for myself receiving this case when I first read the police report and read the transcript of what had been said over the phone. I also had that feeling, that reaction of fear, of feeling like there was a monster out in the community. And for them, that was really how they were feeling after this case. For Violet and Sally, it was a sense of there's a monster out in the community, almost like a boogeyman. I don't know if he's going to come get me. I don't know that I'm safe. I don't know why this happened. So lots of questions, lots of needs are left unmet for those harmed parties. And finally, the responsible party, so Joel in this case, would never understand the full impact of his actions, never understand just how difficult this had been for Sally and Violet, the full extent of the harm that he had caused. And he also wouldn't receive help addressing the needs that led to the behavior. So we wouldn't really understand the why, what led up to this, what was happening in Joel's life that brought us to this moment when he did this horrible thing and caused so much harm. What were the needs that were unmet in his life that led to this negative and harmful behavior? So all of that is left unmet in the wake of a more standard court response. In this case, instead, the process that was used was the restorative justice process. So a police officer talked with Violet and Sally, talked with Joel. They all were willing to go through the restorative justice process because it's always voluntary. And so the case was referred to our restorative justice program. So here's what happened in that restorative justice process. So the man who had made the phone calls was a 24-year-old named Joel. When the group first sat down in a circle together at the restorative justice process, the tension was palpable. After introductions and ground rules, Joel told his side of the story. The week before the phone calls, Joel had been involved in a serious road rage incident in which passengers in another car had pulled out baseball bats and repeatedly hit his car while they were driving down the road. So when Joel was cut off by a car on the day of the incident and experienced the other driver yelling threats at him and his friend through the open window, he was experiencing residual stress from the recent encounter with the baseball bats. Joel saw a phone number on the back of the other driver's car and hoped to call in to report the man's bad driving. When Violet answered, Joel believed he was speaking to the driver who had cut him off and was currently yelling at him and threatening his friend through the window. Joel explained to the circle that he was angry and scared while all this was happening, but that it was no excuse for the things he had said. He expressed how ashamed he felt when he read the police report and saw in print the things he had said over the phone. He mentioned how frightened Violet and Sally must have been and apologized for putting them through that. After Joel, the circle turned to Violet and Sally to tell their side of the story. Violet explained the fear she experienced and her worries about Sally. Sally shared a statement she had written before, explaining some of the heartbreaking abuse from her past and how what was said in the phone calls had impacted her. Both women also expressed worry for Joel, for the way he manages his anger and a desire for him to get help. Next, community members spoke and expressed their concern about a chain of offenses and anger. One person who is angry harms another, who then, out of anger and fear, harms another, and so on. That cycle could continue indefinitely without tools like restorative justice to address repairing harm, rather than continuing cycles of retributive harming. After identifying the harms that had been caused and another heartfelt apology from Joel, the circle moved on to discussing what Joel could do to repair the harm. They arrived at a contract that involved anger management support for Joel and a few assigned book reports on feminist books that Sally wanted Joel to read, among other things. At the end of the conference, both Violet and Sally expressed that their fear was gone. So because a restorative justice process took place, in this case, the needs of the harmed party, the community, and the responsible party were all considered. They all had equal voice and a chance to tell their story of what happened and how they and their families had been impacted. There was also an opportunity for Joel to take responsibility for what he had done. And if you think about it, that's rare in our criminal justice system, that someone has a chance to really fully take responsibility and own up to what they've done, to a mistake that they've made. He was able to apologize to Violet, to Sally, to his friend, to other community members in the process. And he was able to work on some real specific things that could help to make things right. And so that was the outcome, was all about how can he repair the harm to Violet, to Sally, to himself, to the community, and address those needs, those kind of anger needs, that fear need that led to this incident in the first place. And both sides had the opportunity to really humanize each other and to be released from the fear. I mentioned that Violet and Sally, before going through this process, almost had a sense of a boogeyman being out and about, and that kind of constant looming fear that he might show up and do some of these awful things that he threatened. When they were able to meet him and hear the story behind what had happened and experience him really taking responsibility, apologizing, and committing to making things right to the greatest degree possible, that fear was released. And so that does a lot in terms of their own healing and processing the event. So restorative justice, to talk bigger picture here, now that we've looked at this one story example, it's often referred to as a new lens. So Howard Zehr, who was the first to really put into words the philosophy of the restorative justice movement, his first book on this was called Changing Lenses. And that metaphor comes because he's actually a photographer. And so he thinks about it in this way of when you put a new lens on the camera, all of a sudden you see things differently. So restorative justice is really a new lens. When you take this approach, these questions, this way of thinking about what is justice, and apply that lens, then all of a sudden these incidents look really different. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is provide a few different ways for you to think about putting on that new lens and beginning to see crime and conflict in a restorative framework. So let's start first with the most straightforward, a definition of the restorative justice process. So this comes from Professor Chris Marshall in New Zealand. He says, restorative justice is a process whereby all the parties with a stake in a particular offense or harm come together in a safe and controlled environment with trained facilitators to share their feelings and opinions truthfully about what happened and resolve together how best to promote repair and bring about positive changes for all involved. So that process, as you can see, the individuals are seated in a circle. It's facilitated by experienced, trained facilitators who, I should mention, have previously met individually with each of the involved parties. That's called a pre-conference meeting. So they've sat down with everyone individually. They know how everyone's going to come together in that process. They're asking questions and ensuring a safe space that gives the people involved a chance to talk about the impacts, to talk about the story of what happened, to identify the impacts and how people were harmed, and to identify ways for that harm to be repaired and find a positive way to move forward. Another way to think about this, another kind of metaphor that's often used in the restorative justice field, is thinking about the community as a web of relationships. So each of us is deeply connected to each other. What we do necessarily impacts each other. That is just a truth of the human condition. The human condition is one of interconnected relationships. And so a great way to visualize that is through the image of the web. So if you think of that web of interconnected relationships, when a crime or an offense takes place, that is a break in the web. And we see that when there's one break in the web, it can actually ripple out and impact the integrity of the entire web. So the community as a whole feels the ripples of that initial offense. And what is needed then, if we think of a crime or a conflict as a tear in the web, is a need for repair. We need to find ways to repair that web. And what we find when we repair things is they can actually end up being stronger than they were at the beginning. So another image for this, if you think about just kind of classic justice images, how do we conceptualize justice in our society? One that comes to mind is the Lady Justice image. So she's always pictured with her blindfold because justice is blind, her scales for weighing the evidence, and her sword for enacting the punishment. So that's a pretty common image. If you Google justice, it's likely that one of the things that pops up is going to be this Lady Justice image. Now, if we think about what a restorative Lady Justice would look like, this is an illustration that I commissioned from an artist named Phil Dixon who lives in New Zealand. And we were thinking about, what would the restorative Lady Justice look like? So she has put her sword to the side because restorative justice is focused on repairing harm, not on punishment. So we're looking for ways to respond to harm that don't cause additional harm, that are focused on repair and healing. It's about responsibility taking, it's about accountability, so we don't have this need to weigh evidence. Restorative justice is only used when the responsible party is taking responsibility. And she's also taken off her blindfold because she needs to see the individual experiences and needs of the participants in the process and understand what are the actual ripples of impact that have been experienced from this one incident. So you can see she's sitting in a circle, she's engaging in this process with equal voice and equal power in determining outcomes with the rest of the people who were actually involved in the crime that took place. Other ways of thinking about this is kind of a bigger shift in approach. So instead of telling, we are focusing on listening. We're asking questions to find out more information on why this happened and what the needs are now. Instead of knowing the answer, knowing what the outcome could be, we're instead practicing being curious and showing up with that spirit of curiosity and genuine concern. It's shifting away from an institution or a third party trying to restore balance through determining what the outcome of this incident should be, to instead giving the power to those affected to try to restore that balance and to figure out how to make things right. It goes from a focus on the wrongdoer, the offender, the responsible party, to instead a focus on those who were harmed and those who caused the harm. So expanding that focus rather than just what did you do and what should the punishment be, it's who was harmed by this, how has it impacted the community, and also what are your needs, the person who is responsible for the harm. Moving from external coercion to that sense of internal motivation, people deciding for themselves what needs to happen now and willingly committing to that. From justice as punishment to justice as right relationships. So if you think about that, that idea of justice as punishment, it's so ingrained. Oftentimes when you hear the word justice in speeches or in the news, it could almost be exchanged for punishment, and it wouldn't change the meaning of the sentence. Justice so often equals punishment in our public discourse. But this is asking a more fundamental question of what actually is justice? How do we want to define that word and thus influence our entire practice of justice? So this is instead thinking of justice as this idea of being in right relationship with each other, of that interconnected web where we are all treating each other well with respect, and being in right relationship to each other. And so when that is violated, how can we return to that sense of right relationship with each other? I should clarify that when I say relationship, I don't necessarily mean close relationship like friendship or family. It also can mean just that more general sense of societal relationship where we are all sharing common space and have a really basic trust in each other to not cause harm to one another. Now, I think my favorite way to think of this changing lenses is through looking at the questions that are asked in each system. So if we think of the more mainstream retributive justice system, these are the questions that are generally asked. And it's interesting, I've given similar presentations and trainings to so many police officers, lawyers, judges, and there isn't really a lot of pushback on this. This is kind of the basic approach that's being taken in most of our mainstream justice approaches. So the first question being asked is what rule or law was broken here? And I add rule in addition to law because this isn't just criminal justice, right? This is also in schools and universities. We're talking about, what was the violation of the code? What law, what rule was broken? Who did it? And how should they be punished? Those are the three kind of basic questions that are generally asked. So restorative justice is instead asking three different questions. We're asking what happened. We're looking to understand the story of what led to this offense. Who was affected? What are the impacts? How are those people harmed? And what is needed to repair that harm and to make things right? So what can we do to put things back in order, to repair that right relationship, to repair the harm that has been caused? So I want to go ahead and give us another example. Since my first example was from the criminal justice system, this one is actually going to be a case that took place in a university, a case of university misconduct. So I'm going to go ahead and just give a really short introduction to this story so that we can think about it through the framework of these questions. Jude had been dating Rachel for about 2 months, since the first week of school, and really liked her. He had become so attached to Rachel that he hadn't really made other friends in the dorm, preferring to spend most of his time with her. He was devastated when one night Rachel told him she had cheated on him with another resident on the floor, Luke. Rachel left and Jude drank a bottle of wine alone in his room. Around 11 p.m., he heard Luke's voice in the hallway and stumbled out of his room to confront him, shoving Luke into the wall. Luke put up his hands and said, "Hey man," trying to back away, but Jude punched Luke in the jaw before Luke's friends grabbed his arms to restrain him. So if we think about this through these more retributive questions, which oftentimes are the ones that guide a university's response to student misconduct as well. What rule was broken here? So this is clearly an assault, which universities have rules against. It also is a law that has been broken here. Who did it? Jude. And how should they be punished? Now, this is going to vary depending on the processes at different universities, but something like this would likely result in a suspension. There might be other things as well, but likely it's going to look like Jude being taken out of either that dorm community or out of the university community for some period of time, and a kind of immediate separation of the involved parties. So now let's think about this through the restorative questions. So I told you a little bit of what happened, but I would like to add a little bit more information about Jude so that you can understand him more as a person outside of the snapshot of this one incident. So Jude is studying graphic design and hopes to one day work as an animator. He's very emotive and wears his heart on his sleeve. His emotions provide a lot of inspiration for his artwork, both in his animation and also as a poet. He's competed in several slam poetry competitions. He is close with his family, his single mom and younger sister, and it has been hard for him to be so far away from home. Meeting Rachel has really helped him handle the transition, but now it feels like the one bit of stability he had is crumbling. So that gives you a little bit more context around Jude. Now, if we had him here with us and we were having a pre-conference process as facilitators, we'd of course be able to ask more and understand even more about what happened. We'd be able to have the same experience with Rachel and Luke and hear their kind of whole story of what led up to this incident, why it happened, and what it was like for them, what they were thinking about, what they were feeling at the time. So moving to the next question, who was affected? So I'm going to give you just a moment to think about that. Who was affected? Likely you will come up with even more people than I am going to name in the next minute here. Because when you start thinking about the world in this way, you really begin to see the ripples of an incident like this. But of course, Luke has been affected. He's been punched. He is going to have the physical impact of that and also the emotional impact of that. His friends who were with him, of course, are also impacted, are going to be feeling likely some fear, some perhaps concern that there's something they should have done differently in the moment. Likely Rachel is going to be impacted as well when she hears what has unfolded. She is very much so at the center of this. She might also have a lot of questions, a lot of concern, some fear, and possibly some guilt as well. It's hard to know. That's going to vary depending on the individual, what their kind of personal impact is. And then Jude, of course, is also affected. He is now broken the trust that he had with other members of his dorm community. Rumors spread like wildfires, and this is going to impact his reputation in the university. He's heartbroken. He's likely feeling a lot of guilt, some shame. So he's having a lot of effects as well, and this might also potentially be impacting his studies for all of them as well. Beyond that, the wider dorm community is feeling that break in the web, is feeling the ripples of impact because there's less of a sense of community and safety when something like this is happening in your living space. Going even beyond that, the families of all three of the involved people are, of course, going to be worried, are not going to know how to support their children from afar or their siblings. We could also think about the impacts on the university as a whole. Universities, it's quite important to have a good reputation so that new students feel that they're coming to a place that's safe and supportive and has a really good connected community. Stories like this and other misconduct and events that happen at universities can really damage that overall sense of what this community is like to be a part of. And we could keep going from there, really. I mean, there's kind of endless ripples, but just beginning to think about it in this framework of not just what rule, what law was violated, but also what are the impacts? Why does it matter? Who has been harmed? What is the harm here? So then going to that final question, what's needed to repair the harm and make things right? And it's amazing to me, whenever I do this activity with groups of people, almost always the first thing that is said is, well, we need to get Jude and Luke together, or whoever the two people in the case are together, or three people or four. They need to sit down together. There needs to be a chance for them to talk. Jude needs to apologize. He needs to find a way to make things right with Luke, with Rachel, with the dorm. And what's interesting to me is, yes, that does feel like the logical first step is for these people to talk if they feel, safe and willing to do so. But so often that doesn't happen, right? It's usually separation is our first response, which then puts Jude in a really interesting position when he comes back from being suspended and is back in that same community of people, but hasn't had any chance to take responsibility, to apologize, to work to make things right. other things that Jude might do, it really could look like anything. And you see a lot of really creative agreement ideas coming out of the restorative justice process. Likely there's going to be an apology. I talked a little bit about who Jude is as a person, that he likes graphic design, animation, slam poetry. And we talked about the harm that was experienced in the wider dorm community. So maybe there's something that he's going to do at this point to repair the harm to the wider community. Maybe there's a need for his graphic design skills in advertising the next community building event. Maybe he could help organize the next event. Maybe it could be a slam poetry competition. There's a lot of different things that would both help to make the community feel like a more connected and caring place again, thus repairing that harm that he caused, and also address the need that in part led to this behavior. So part of why Jude was so devastated, we know from the scenario about Rachel breaking up with him, was because he doesn't have other connections. He's really just fostered his connection with her, and he hasn't made other friends. And so getting him involved in some meaningful way that uses his strengths and is something that he is excited about will help him to make more connections and ensure that something like this won't happen again, because he'll feel a sense of place and have other connections he can fall back on when really difficult, heartbreaking things happen in his life. And so you can see how that would work to both repair some of the harm that's been caused and also address the needs that led to the harmful behavior in the first place. So once again, that contract of what Jude ultimately commits to do to make things right, it could look a lot of different ways. What's important is that the individuals that are sitting down together, who were actually involved in the incident, after identifying the harm that had been caused, feel that what Jude is going to do meaningfully contributes to making things right and repairing that harm. And generally that contract then gets followed up on by some sort of case coordinator person to make sure that Jude follows through and completes the items by a certain deadline, so that there's that continuing accountability even after the end of the meeting with everyone together. So you can see how those questions, just asking a totally different set of questions in the wake of crime or misconduct, completely changes our response, our approach to enacting justice. So I want to talk a little bit about what has been the ever-expanding applications of restorative justice. So to give a little bit of history, first of all, the restorative justice philosophy and approach to justice making is very much so rooted and has its original home in Indigenous justice making processes. So particularly the Maori people in New Zealand and also North American Indigenous people. Now, in terms of kind of the modern application to our Western criminal justice system, that started in the 70s in Canada with an experiment in bringing victims and offenders, or harm parties and responsible parties, together. And it has expanded from there. Like I said, New Zealand has it the most integrated into its criminal justice system. Colorado is one of the leaders in the states, but it varies quite a bit, particularly in the US, by city. And different cities have it in different places, whether it's a diversion or a pre-sentence or a reintegration even after a punitive sanction. But that kind of use in the criminal justice system is expanding rapidly even today. After it kind of got its footing in the criminal justice system, teachers began to learn about restorative justice and began to bring it into schools. So thinking about in schools, they were suspending people and expelling people and using kind of that same approach of, well, what rule was broken here, who did it, and how are we going to punish them? And teachers said, that's leading to a lot of negative outcomes for our students. It's not helping with our sense of community cohesion, with healing the harm that's been caused, and it's contributing to the school to prison pipeline. And so teachers began to use the restorative justice process in schools as an alternative to suspension and expulsion with really great results. And after seeing the success in schools, universities and then workplaces started to also use restorative justice for their own issues of misconduct. And that's, where we are today is more and more universities, schools, workplaces, and more individual, cities, criminal justice systems starting to use this process, this approach. Now, another thing that happened in schools that is really amazing and has strengthened this work amazingly is this idea of restorative justice not being just reactive, so not being just something we do after an incident of misconduct, after harm has been caused, but also proactive. So this idea of a holistic system that's really focused on relationships. So out of that has emerged processes for building relationships, like circles practice, which I won't go into much today, but circles are a way of building a respectful, connected sense of community in a group. They're also often used to establish community norms so that we're deciding together how are we going to act together as a community. And then they also innovated practices for maintaining relationships. So when just something little has happened, someone's speaking out in class and the teacher needs to have a conversation, instead of it just looking like, okay, go to the hall, how can we think about this more through the framework of the restorative questions of what happened, what are the impacts of what happened, and what's needed to make things right. So out of that arose circle processes, but then also the restorative conversation model for having a one-on-one conversation that is in the framework of restorative justice. So looking at impacts, looking at repair, and always supporting and building on relationship. And then at the top of the triangle is still these processes for repairing relationships, like the restorative justice process we've been talking about, and other types of kind of innovative circle practices. And so a restorative community really uses both the proactive and the reactive processes, and the triangle represents how much time and energy is being committed to each, so that when more time and energy is put into really building relationships that have that foundation of respect, of equal voice, of safety, then less time is needed to maintain and to repair relationships. So schools often are talking about, and universities as well, how can we do most of our work on the proactive side and use restorative practices as a wide body of processes to prevent these more harmful things from happening? How can we be proactive? So there's a lot more to say about that, but I won't go into that in this introduction space, because restorative practices opens us up into a much wider body of processes that are powerful and have a tremendous impact in communities. Now, there are a few really new frontiers in this work, one of which is using these processes with neighborhood disputes. That's something I've been involved in a bit with community groups such as nonprofits, churches, other faith communities that are having their own sources of conflict and looking for ways to build, maintain, and repair relationships. And so those have been some new applications. There's also some work being done in the medical malpractice field now. And finally, environmental harm is a new frontier for restorative justice work. So thinking about harm that is experienced to the environment through this framework of how are people impacted, definitely, but also how is land and rivers, and how is kind of our natural environment impacted, and what can be done to repair. So not just corporations violating a law and then being fined, what can be done to actually think about it in this framework of repairing the harm that has been caused. So an interesting example of this that's kind of in alignment with this philosophy, that river in the photo is the Wanganui River in New Zealand, which has recently been given the status of legal personhood, which then opens up this new space to be able to think about the harm that has been experienced by the river and to make plans to restore the harm experienced by the river, in addition to the Maori iwi, the Maori tribes that live around it and have it as a really central part of their lives. So this is a really interesting recent application. The European Forum for Restorative Justice just recently issued a really excellent report or kind of booklet on this environmental application as well. It's definitely a growing and promising new space and new frontier for restorative work. And I would say that this really illustrates where restorative justice is now. It's this philosophy, this process that has kind of proven itself in the criminal justice system and in schools and universities. And more people are saying, this looks like something that I could use. This seems like an approach that could be helpful, a lens, a framework, a philosophy that could give us something new in this additional space that I'm involved in. And so it's a really exciting time in the restorative justice field. If you're interested in learning more, I have a couple suggested resources for you just to start, and I'm happy to recommend more as well if you'd like to be in touch. The Little Book of Restorative Justice by Howard Zehr, it really is a very small book, but very powerful. This is the first text that I personally read on restorative justice, and I credit this book with changing my life completely. I still have my first copy, and the margins are just full of stars and underlines. And it really does a great job of articulating in a very succinct form the philosophy of restorative justice, the approach. So I highly recommend it. It's also quite inexpensive. If you would like to see what a restorative justice process looks like, oftentimes after being introduced to the idea, people just want to say, show me what this looks like when you actually bring a harmed party, responsible party together and try to identify the impacts and repair the harm. If you go to my website, which is lindseypointer.com, and look under videos, you'll be able to find a mock restorative justice process video, which has an introduction to the scenario. It also has a sample pre-conference, which is once again that pre-meeting where the facilitators meet with each of the involved parties individually. And then it has the restorative justice process where everyone is brought together. And I'll just say that those are, of course, abbreviated, and so you'll see in the video that certain pieces are left out so that they aren't quite long, because the standard restorative justice process is going to be quite a bit longer. But those will give a good idea of what this looks like. Another suggestion I have is to reach out to local programs who are doing this work. If you're really interested, there are opportunities to learn in a more hands-on manner, to volunteer, to kind of gain some of these skills, and I would be happy to help make connections with local programs. So thank you so much for listening to this introduction to restorative justice. I welcome continued communication with you. I would love to continue a dialogue about restorative justice. You'll find a link to my website on the right, and also my email address below. Please do not hesitate to reach out. This is my absolute favorite thing to talk about in the world, and so I would love to hear your thoughts and to be of help in connecting you to further resources if you would like to learn more. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.